And as we grow more in the profession, we would certainly like to diversify the employee base, and we're working toward that goal. And I think that would help with the effective procedure of justice and an understanding of all of these many aspects in which we face. So our audience, we have educators, we have state officials. I'd love to hear from you. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. You can open your mic or put something in the chat, and we are glad to facilitate the question either way.
I have a question. Hello, Mr. Ivey.
How are you?
Fine. How are you? I have watched your career. I remember when you were state's attorney. I was so impressed with you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes. So when we're looking at discretion and we're looking at these officers who are making these stops towards Black men, there's got to be, and I'm looking at the top, and these are the sergeants, lieutenants, these superintendent. I never see, and maybe, I watch the media. Why aren't they going after the top people? These are the ones that are doing the training. These are the ones that give that department, I guess, the attitude, or this is how we're seen. We tend to go after that officer who's done something wrong, okay, and illegal, but they had to, again, why were they hired? What was the standards of hiring? And we talk about discretion again, because I teach that in my classes. And it's gotta, maybe we need to focus on the top people.
I think that's right. I agree. But let me draw a contrast for you though, too. So on the one hand, you've got the types of stops we were talking about, which are public policy driven. By and large, all of this stuff got started when crack hit the cities and police officers didn't know what to do. Mayors and chiefs as well. So they were like, let's try this. And that's kind of where it landed. And it was aggressive, and it gave the public, you could generate a lot of numbers. We got a lot of arrests that came out of this. We got a lot of guns off the street, and they have the press conference to lay the guns on the table and all the drugs, and and we seized all these cars, and now we got all this money, so there's a whole sort of positive visual spin that comes with it. And so they don't tend to throw those officers under the bus, because really the officers are following orders, and they created units to do it and the like. Compare that with the shootings, right? And that's one where there had been a lot of efforts to defend officers and their exercise of discretion in using deadly force. That's receded pretty dramatically in the last few years, and that's largely the video. So when I first got elected, the big fight in Prince George's County between the police and the state's attorney's office was over, walk a mile in my shoes. I'm out there, it's dangerous. I got to use force, it's life and death circumstances. And there's truth in that. And then you'd have people say, no, he shot, he shouldn't have done it. And he jumped the gun. But a lot of times they're not, quote unquote, as credible as the officers and the like. So when it comes to court, you frequently had acquittals coming out of that. But then came the iPhone. And so everybody's taping everything. And now when you see those videos, it's really shocking, some of these circumstances where people are being shot. And the cameras in the cars is another big step forward. But the iPhone piece, I think, really woke up the public as to what's happened there. And so what you've got now is, especially in the last year or two, chiefs are losing their jobs over this. Breonna Taylor over there in Louisville, or here in Prince George's County, you had a chief leave all of a sudden. And I don't know if there's a direct correlation between that and the individual that was killed in the front seat of that car by a police officer. But, there's a real stark difference there. And I think the big key is the accountability, the visibility that comes with what the cameras give you. Now, you can't have that in every police stop and every time they stop, every traffic stop. That's why the data is so important, right? So, and then if you have the data that shows, hey, look, this is going on at this level. And Mr. Chief, when we hired you, you said you were going to try and address this, but look, the numbers are, these numbers are appalling. How can you let this happen? Then you can impose accountability in a way that, is currently hard to do, because the data is still being built out. I think there's some jurisdictions ahead of where we are, certainly in Prince George's, but statewide here too. But as the data catches up, I think accountability will come with it.
Okay.
One other thing too is, elected officials are penalized for for seeking out some of this information, right? So if you tell a police chief, hey, I want you to address this, and let's say police chief brings in, a national policing group or Department of Justice or something, says, take a look at this. Well, if they come back with bad results, the chief's in trouble. The mayor's in trouble, the county executive's in trouble. So I think we have to find ways, if you can have the data on an ongoing basis, as opposed to just the occasional audit, I think that'll help to smooth out the political accountability problem that comes for the person who directed it. If it's going on, if we get the same data every year, and when it's published, we put it out on the website so everybody can see it, and the Baltimore Sun or the Washington Post can do their expose on it, or schools can do research or the like, I think then you can really get it so that the officials are on board with it in the same way that they are now, or increasingly, with not defending every shooting that takes place when an officer draws his gun.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Great question.
Other questions?
I've got one more waiting that sort of got spurred by the beginning portion of Mary's. You mentioned the sort of the public policy side of things, and that's where I come from, is the political side of this sort of thing. It is super hard to combat the narrative of like, look, we caught $1 million in trafficking and it's all sitting here on this table, isn't that shiny? With, I guess, sort of the old good stories don't sell all that well. Have you found any sort of, what kind of metric or, in my head, I just want to say shiny object, but sort of a counter narrative object that's been good to focus on, that does grab people's attention in a way that could sort of compete with that? Because at the moment, I feel like if you want to try and change public policy, like you said earlier, the political debate is fractured as is, but the best chance we have is to not just argue that you're not paying attention to a thing that matters. Is to give a counter narrative example that we know does.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think you really put your finger on a sort of a public debate problem, because on the one hand, you're right. I mean, the other argument, in addition to the press conference with the guns and the drugs and everything on the table, is it, man, Lord forbid that the crime numbers go up after you do some kind of reform, because the immediate argument will be, see, you tied the officers' hands and they feel like they can't police, and the criminals are running amok out there because they know they can do whatever they want and the cops won't stop them. So we need to roll it back. So those are really strong arguments. And I got to say that those of us on the left on this issue have not done a great job of putting out data to the contrary on the other side. There's more coming out increasingly, but it's still not quite caught up yet. I think the strength on the other side, with respect to progressive approaches to this, has been sort of two big factors. One is the one we just talked about, the video evidence that's been there, that's really kind of, I think, been a real surprise to, I was going to say middle America, but pretty much everybody who's not living in low-income African-American neighborhoods, where you see that all the time, or Latino neighborhoods. Everybody else was like, wow, what? That's shocking. The other big one was the impact of DNA on murder and rape cases. And so this one's older than the iPhone impact, but you've been about 20 years now of getting people off death row or who've been in jail for 30 or 40 years because the DNA cleared them. But even after the DNA shows that they shouldn't have been there, sometimes it can still take an additional 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to actually get those guys out. Again, because of the process piece, which I think is something that needs to be addressed. So I think those have been the two things on the other side that have really had people reconsider it. And And then the last big factor is the number of people in jail. You know, once we passed China and became the international leader in, you know, incarceration, not just now, but in all of human history, I think that was a bit of a wake-up call. But I think really it's going to be a political fight. I think a lot of the people who are on the ground protesting and demanding changes in the criminal justice system, I think are motivated in part by the police excessive force piece, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor scenarios that really launched the protests out on the street late spring, early summer this year. And I think put a lot of pressure on elected officials and community leaders to rethink their approach to that. But I think there's got to be more and continuing effort to sort of revise that. I also want to say too that I don't think it was helpful. The defund the police mantra I thought was not useful, to say the least, in pushing this agenda forward. I think it sort of misfocused what the debate was really about. I don't think people really want to defund the police. And in the low income, high crime neighborhoods, frequently you'll see these shootings and they'll go out and it's, for some reason, the TVs will cover it. Like usually it's a kid that gets shot, like a 5-year-old or something. And the people who live in that neighborhood, the first thing they say is, we need more police out on the street, around here. So they don't want to get rid of the police, but they want to be policed correctly and fairly. And so I think that needs to be the focus of where we go. But, it's a great question. It's the argument on spin. I think, progressive approaches to criminal justice reform have been behind for decades now, which is how we got to this point. But I think we're starting to turn the tide and make some headway in response.
Thank you. Yeah, I think progressive spin arguments or presentation of a coherent thesis to an argument in politics is catching up on a lot of things lately.
Yeah, you hope so. But, it's funny because a lot of times until you get that bumper sticker to it, I'll give you an example of the other side, in my view, the other side being great at coming up with slogans. Stop the steal, right? I mean, I think it's totally wrong. I don't think anything was stolen. These weren't fraudulent elections. But I was like, man, as soon as I heard it, I was like, they'll be able to chant that one while they're walking down the street. It rolls off the tongue. And so, we've got to get as good as they are. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be, partisan, but I mean, but for these kinds of causes, I think we have to develop those kinds of skills and finding ways to reach people that's easy to remember and easy to understand. It still gets the right message across.
Then I guess summarizing for Kathy's convenience and using this for our educational purposes, it's a great argument for how to effectively interpret data for a public audience.
There you go.
Thank you. Yeah. So welcome, Mr. Joe Vince and Netta Squires. Joe, Mount St. Mary's University, I'm sure a familiar face. Netta is our criminal law instructor. Questions from anyone in the audience?
We've got one sitting in the chat waiting from Dee Dee, it looks like. I was in the order where I was being answered and wanted to pay attention rather than read.
All right.
Collecting and publishing. After collecting and publishing data on the situation at hand, are there reliable ways to correlate that to the identified problem of extremists infiltrating military or police for training or power? Psychological tests don't tend to do a good job of identifying unsuitable candidates, and sort of I'll add what we just talked about is like you can get a little bit of the political aspect in there as well. Is there a good way to identify for that?
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, there's a real trade-off between, giving people access to public service and the level of scrutiny that you impose sort of at the gate when they come in and then after they're there. Now, I think for traditionally, the CIA world, constant and total scrutiny just comes with the territory and everybody understands that. But, to identify, let's say, rank and file soldiers or police officers, to catch some of the things that we're now seeing, now that people are looking at it, people being the media primarily, they're monitoring their Facebook pages and websites and private conversations and the like. And I'm a bit torn because I'm a civil libertarian. I think people ought to have a chance to voice their views, and especially their political views. But, you know, some of the things we've been seeing, like the one the other day, you know, putting a bullet in Nancy Pelosi's head, which became nationally prominent because the QAnon Congress member, what's her name, Taylor Greene, gave it a thumbs up, you know, so everybody knew what that was now. But, you know, typically to find that, you know, part of me, I kind of recoil a bit about the level of, I don't want to say intrusion, but, you know, how much scrutiny are we going to give people in their day-to-day lives? And if we do all soldiers and cops, you're really talking about building a very massive apparatus to monitor folks. On the other hand, it's scary to think about people who are in those positions and what they might do with it. And to take it one step further, you know, the Turner Diaries world sort of assumes you're going to have a lot of individual military with that set of skills that are going to want to join this movement that they're trying to launch to overthrow the government based on a race war. And so you look at some of the people that got arrested at the Capitol, and I don't know that they were Navy SEALs per se, but there are people who are really trained at, you know, military assault weapons and wreaking havoc, certainly in a civilian a domestic scenario. It's really scary what just a handful of these guys could do. But, you know, look at the people who were trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. There's some really troubling people there, not just because of what they were thinking, but what they have the training and capability of doing. So I think there has to be an enhanced level of scrutiny. But then the other step is, when you get the information, you've got to be willing to act on it. And so increasingly it's become clear that the Capitol Police knew there were a lot of people and that were going to be coming to Washington and potentially to the Capitol who had the types of skills we're talking about, but for a variety of reasons just decided not to respond in a way that made sense under the circumstances. And when you contrast that with the level of preparation they had for these, you know, essentially nonviolent protesters who came out for, you know, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, the Lafayette Square protest, but in other parts of Washington, D.C., where you had, like the one where my client's involved, they had National Guard there, they had mounted police there, they had flash bombs and rubber bullets and tear gas, which they used on the protesters before the curfew had even hit. So, you know, but you flip that back to the Capitol, you have anybody within, you know, the guys that wand you in, you know, when you come through the metal detectors, maybe a couple other officers, but really not much more than that. And certainly not the level of preparation or the show of force that had happened in Washington just in the previous months. So I think we have to be willing to also, when we see that evidence and we see that information, be willing to use it, and not just, these guys look like me, so I guess they're probably right, or they don't look like a group that would be doing too much dangerous or, you know, wreaking any havoc or violence. You can't do it that way. You got to be, I think, blind to some of the things that maybe caused law enforcement to distinguish between those two crowds in the exactly backwards way.
And we have one last question in our chat. Be mindful of our time. Alan, will you hit that question for us? Or it's from Robin. If you want to open up your mic, open it up.
Say, Robin, if you're in, then cool. If not, then I got you. Whatever works.
Thanks, Alan. I was just having a little trouble with my system, so I didn't want it to break up. If you don't mind, that would be great.
I got you. Robin has asked the oldest and possibly most important question in the political science book. given the current climate of law enforcement, and I would expand that to the current climate of all politics ever, and understanding that there is a disparity between sort of what the media conveys and the amount of facts available at all times, what suggestions do you have? What strategies do you have that have succeeded to help guide students through that without seeming like one side, without providing a push towards either side? Instructors as neutral people versus trying to address fact disparities. Essentially, we support open dialogue and expression of opinions, but don't want to turn into a heated argument. So how do you not blow up your class?
Well, I think that goes down to sort of fact checking information, and you know, in the context. I taught at University of Maryland Law School for 20 years, and you know, you can walk into, and it was advanced criminal procedure. So you know, you walked into some of these controversial positions every class, and I frequently had, you know, cops in the class, aspiring public defenders in the class, and you know, the whole range in between. But I think part of it is, you know, you want to try and see if you can get them to challenge all factual sources. I mean, when I was in office and the Washington Post would cover me or trials that we were having, I would frequently read them and say, man, this isn't even close to right. Were they in the same courtroom that I was in? And there are factors that drive that. You know, space, they can't give all of the details. Increasingly now, newspapers have very young reporters. Even the Washington Post has, you know, sort of some of their lead rank and file reporters are, it's almost like their first or second job out of college, is, you know, covering very big stories. I know this isn't discretion, you're not teaching that crowd, but they've got room for growth as well on that front. So I don't think you tell your class that if it's in the New York Times or Washington Post, you know, it must be true, because I frequently disagree with some of their positions. On the other hand, I think, you know, there are certainly people out there, and when you go to the media world, the social media world, they really have just entirely separate agendas that they're pushing that aren't really based on fact. And one way to measure it is it an outlet that publishes alternative views? And so for me, you know, the opinion pages and the editorial pages are the least read parts of newspapers, or whatever you call them now in the election. But I usually start there because good newspapers have their spin, and their editorial page definitely has it. But for example, the Washington Post, George Will writes for the Washington Post, super conservative, although he's come around, you know, some of the things that surprise me that I read, because he feels that things that the Republican Party's doing aren't consistent with the Republican principles that drew him to the party to start with. And so one thing you might want to encourage your students to do is to use sources where they're presenting both sides of the fact, just like you're trying to do with your class. And if they're getting their information from an echo chamber, and I don't watch MSNBC really. I mean, every now and then I'll turn to it, but it's so one-sided that you don't really get a chance to hear what the other arguments are. CNN, in their political coverage, they'll put on Rick Santorum, who was the conservative former senator from Pennsylvania, but he's on a panel with six liberal Democrats, so you can barely get a word in edgewise. So, you know, my suggestion would be to try and find sources that have balance and recognize there isn't always truth in capital letters. But, you know, there's a difference between willful ignorance or willful negative, just factually incorrect people or information that's being pushed, as opposed to, yeah, we've got political differences, philosophical differences, and especially when you're trying to determine public policy in the future, none of us have a crystal ball. On the other hand, if there's facts that are out there that probably add up, you know, you should pay attention to it. A couple quick examples. the scientific world, I think, let's say, I don't know, let's take global warming or, climate change. Well, yeah, I know there's a lot of folks in the United States who either don't believe in it or think it's, totally partisan and political and everything. And when I'm debating with those folks, usually I say to them, look, I know you don't necessarily care about what scientists in Europe or Asia or, or Africa or overseas are finding, but, isn't it curious that in countries where they don't have Democrats and Republicans, in fact, sometimes in countries where there's just a totalitarian regime, even in their universities, they're pointing out the same things that we are on this global warming piece. Clearly, it's not purely political. What do you think it might be? COVID is another one. Okay, don't wear a mask because it became a partisan, almost definitional distinction. If you're wearing a mask, you're a rhino or something. But if you look at other countries, totalitarian countries like China, they're wearing masks now. And the reason they're doing it is because there's a scientific reason to believe that it slows the spread of the virus and therefore protects the public. So I try and push in that direction. We recognize there are going to be scenarios where there's differences of opinion, especially when we're trying to predict the outcome of things in the future. There are going to be, personal views that drive different outcomes, like we talked about judges a minute ago. But even there, you ought to be able to find some common set of facts, especially in the scientific world, where there's really pretty much a consensus built around it. And if you have to leave that world of consensus to get to the evidence that supports your view, you really need to rethink it. Vaccines, the anti-vax world is another example of that. They're in their echo chamber. They believe what they say. I got in big trouble over this when I was in office, but it's pretty clear that, in my view anyway, public vaccinations were probably the greatest 20th century advancement in public health in the world, with the possible exception of penicillin and some of the not virus, but the anti-infection drugs. So, it's going to be ugly. It's real ugly right now. I don't want to dismiss the difficulties and the challenges you're seeing in classrooms or courtrooms or boardrooms for that matter. But I think forcing people to acknowledge a common set of facts to the extent possible is the way to go.
Thank you so much. Certainly my generation is benefiting from the vaccine, so I'm cheering that comment forward. For our last couple of minutes, Fire Chief Steve Lohr has asked to make a comment, and then we'll bring this to a close on time like I promised. Steve?
I'm sorry, I have to unmute. Thank you, Kathy, and hello to all my friends and colleagues. So I couldn't agree more with Mr. Ivey's assessment. I love his description of discretion and due process. I thought that was monumental. So thank you for that today. That's one of my takeaways. Full disclosure, I spent a full career in Montgomery County, liberal Montgomery County. I live and work now in one of the most conservative regions in the state of Maryland. And I proudly declare myself a middle of the road person without any party affiliation. But what I've encountered here has been eye-opening in the fact that most of the people we hired, and I think Robin could speak to this as a former Montgomery County police officer, we encouraged academia, we encouraged college degrees, and what I observed there was the ability of people to conduct critical thinking. And when they are able and taught to conduct critical thinking, which is the role of higher education, not just training, particularly in a workforce like the fire department or the police department, right, wrong, or indifferent, we are quasi-military. And from the day you step forth in recruit school, it's task, it's tactics, and it's strategies, and you better follow the rules or be damned. So I would suggest we all have a role to change that culture if we're going to encourage our folks not to just blindly follow direction that may have been or may not have been appropriate 30 years ago, 50 years ago, and begin the process of critical thinking. And I think it all blends together. I'll just stop there today, but thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for sharing and for being here and helping us carry this message forward. And Glenn, thank you. We benefited greatly from our time with you today. Your work will continue to go forward into our classrooms, all the way from some of our secondary education to university programs in the state of Maryland. So we greatly appreciate that. Anyone else want to say anything before we close? Mr. Hubbard?
Yeah, just real quickly, Mr. Ivey, thank you so much for your candor. This does not work if we're not willing to, put ourselves out there and explain our situations and our pathways through life. So that was a key takeaway for me is, hearing 360 degrees of an issue, I think, and Mr. Lord just said it, is just so important for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Glenn. So you have a whole champion of educators out there doing good work so that your job is different in the future. How does that sound?
Well, I appreciate the fantastic work you all are doing and the new crop of leadership that you're producing. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for joining us, everyone, today. Be safe and tune in again. We have 2 more sessions, and we're going to bring this home for our Reclaiming Humanity and continue our good work. Have a good day.